I give the call to the Honourable Brian Walker.
Thank you, Acting President. I think, first off, I'd have to give thanks. There's an awful lot of work has gone into this budget, and there's much to be appreciative of. And what I'm going to say in my following remarks is going to be not at all critical, but hopefully something supportive to the work of the government, because there are, of course, areas that need work in this. Noting, of course, there's a huge reserve, and this is an excellent situation to be in. Excellent work. I mean, reversing the deficits that we had in previous governments is an amazing task, whichever the government does that. And it can set, of course, the tone for the next years. The question I have is, have we chosen wisely? Well, yes, to a large degree, but is it completely perfect? And the answer, of course, is no. And I note the words yesterday from the Honourable Peter Collier, and I've long been mentioning this, about the governmental hubris. Because, you see, what we have here is in our democratic system, in this House of Review, we're not really having the capacity to review. Certainly, we can comment. Certainly, we can put our point of view across. But it doesn't get reflected in the legislation coming through, which means, of course, that we're saying that the legislation created by the PCO and brought on by the government is perfect from beginning to end. And that clearly is not the case. They're never the case. There's always room for improvement, and no improvements have been taken on. And this, I think, this governmental hubris, I think, could be a millstone around your necks in the future. But leading on from that, our huge budget reserves there, largely attributable, of course, to our resources, which have led the way, an asset which, of course, is being sold to China, among many other countries. Now, these resources will last a long time, but it is not a sustainable, indefinitely sustainable option. So we have to be looking at what the future could bring to us. And focusing solely on our resources, we have a resource in front of us and it's very easy to use, well, if you're a billionaire, and that leads to a loss of self-sufficiency, because we have this resource that someone else needs and we give it, and when we no longer have that, or when the other country no longer needs it, then we are in dire straits. And I would wonder if that is the best thing for Western Australia. It does lead to the loss of self-sufficiency as we depend disproportionately on these exports. And then neglecting to also to a degree our agricultural resources, which are depleted by modern agriculture, with the chemical industry, which is changing the landscape, the climate change which we're experiencing, and, of course, the questions of foreign ownership. These are issues which need to be reflected, I think, in a sensible, calm look at how we could regulate our Western Australian economy to the benefit of Western Australians. And I note one of the problems that we all face is that when it comes to bureaucracy, red tape seems to be disproportionately present. And we ought to be looking at how we could reduce red tape. I'm reminded of someone who might have a ministerium for reducing red tape. That would be actually a fine task to have. But going on, remembering the resources and how they are treating our land, looking at the damage we had recently to Indigenous land, I'm not actually referring to Juukan Gorge. I'm referring here to Wittenoom, the most egregious destruction and lasting, I think, many decades into the future. We're looking at water mismanagement in the Pilbara. I saw there's 20 gigalitres of water which could be better used than flowing off into rivers. It could be used for irrigation. It could be used for restoring the quality of land to the Indigenous population. And I note also that there's possibly a miscommunication within the offices of the larger businesses, where the water itself is, I have this from consultations, that the one topic of water divided up amongst 3 offices which weren't speaking to each other, which leads, of course, to inefficiencies in operation. And inefficiencies always cost the bottom line. So these are areas where we might be working at improving how we manage our finances. Because the bottom line to the state budget is always detrimental to every single West Australian. And I don't see this actually mirrored in the budget, how we're going to actually look at wastage. So I encourage this to be looked at in greater detail. And we also have now, going forward, the upcoming stresses to ordinary West Australians. In recent years, and looking today at the red appearing on the stock market and how billions have been removed from the funds and the the pension funds are losing value. People are looking at existential questions. The cost of living is going up. The cost of housing is becoming unaffordable. And of course, what I see in particular in my practice, that mental health problems are increasing. These, of course, all lead to a sense of a loss of quality of life in our state, something we should be looking at very closely as well. This moves on to the question, of course, of the post-COVID life, which requires navigating. And again, I mention here the mental health damage which has been suffered. And the things I see actually on a regular basis when I'm not actually in Parliament, when I'm doing my general practice clinic work, the amount of stress which people are experiencing, partly also the financial losses they're experiencing. But also, what I'm hearing from my constituents is a loss of trust. A loss of trust in government as a result of the sense of life not being as well as it might be. Now, trust, of course, is a matter here of leadership, and leadership being needed, and good leadership has been offered, but it needs to be led by pulling people along, not pushing people, not forcing people. That way is the way of a despot. The great leaders will encourage, leading from the front, getting people to follow by dint of their personality, their charismatic behaviour. And part of that leadership has to also depend upon being known for telling the truth in all areas. And this is a very important thing to do. Now, cults do this as well. They insist that the truth that they tell is the only truth there is, and everyone else is actually lying or misinforming you. And this is very easy a trap to fall into. So we have to be aware of what truth is actually being told. I despair when I remember on television hearing for the first time from the mouth of the press secretary in the USA about alternative facts, which is another way of saying we're lying, draw back teeth, but we're going to call it truth and you're going to believe it. And people did. And the consequences we have all seen. We need hard facts. We need good science. So leading on with this good science is something that the Premier himself has said we need to follow the science. Now, I'm going to divert here a little bit and talk about my personal experience when driving along the road and seeing a road under repair sign 40 kilometres per hour. And, of course, you slow down, well, I do, and you go along at 40 kilometres an hour. There's not a worker in sight. There's maybe a few cones placed out there, and 2 kilometres down the road, the signs say you can go back to your normal speed. And I thought, why did I slow down to 40 kilometres an hour? So the next time you come across 40 kilometres an hour sign, you slow down, and lo and behold, there are still no workers on the road. It's a sign put up there, but the work is not being done. There's no need for that sign to be there. And by the third time you come across this, you begin to realise these signs don't actually mean what they say. They're put up there, they're left, and they don't actually mean this has to be 40 kilometres an hour. It's I haven't been bothered to remove the sign, or I've put it up and I haven't got to work yet. So we tend to, then the next time you see that sign, you're maybe not going to slow down to 40 kilometres an hour when you should. And so what happens here is we've taken it for granted. The wolf has been called too often, and that's when accidents happen, because you don't slow down and accidents can happen. So we have to be aware of replicating that behaviour when we play loose with the facts. It has huge implications for the buy-in from the public. And mentioning this governmental hubris again, detrimental to public buy-in when facts are put out which are not actually facts. We were hearing yesterday, again from the Honourable Peter Collier, about the claim this Indigenous lady was assaulted by police, basically, and they claimed 5,000 or so documents had been leaked. When in fact, if it had been by this person at all, it was maybe 6 documents. And so you begin to look at these things coming out, and you think, I can't really believe what is being said. When you can't believe what is being said, we lose trust in the person saying it, we lose trust in the government, we lose trust in the process of government, we lose trust in politicians in general. And that is terrible, because as people who are supposed to lead this country, we need to be seen as trustworthy, that when we speak, that our words are true. We heard yesterday from Honourable Dan Caddy a very nice talk, and I heartily approve of that, about how words are important. They are meaningful. They are essential that we have words which are given with meaning, with intent, and are correct and are believed to be true. So with that in mind, setting that tone there, looking at the health system, well, I'm referring here to the budget, of course, and how can we then make additions to the budget. I'm not asking for more money, I'm asking for more attention. Long COVID didn't really feature in the budget much. General COVID monies were being given by all means. But long COVID is something which has long concerned me. Now, it's not very sexy as a topic. COVID itself, when people are maybe dying in ICU, 16-year-olds dying, among the many 90 and 100-year-olds who are dying, and you can make people afraid of this. You can traumatize them. Oh, there's COVID coming, we're going to die. And now we've got the vaccine, now we've got hospital services going. We're going to have maybe a better outcome. What about the long COVID? Because here I see a greater risk to our bottom line by people who are suffering from the effects of a viral infection which has long-standing consequences, not just a month or two, but possibly 8 months, possibly a year and a half, maybe even longer. Now, I see this as a regular habit in my practice, people coming to me with post-viral infections 18 months, maybe 5 years previously, and they're still suffering from chronic fatigue syndrome. And they've been put from pillar to post, but it's actually the result of an infection which has resulted in their own immune defences being less responsive, being less helpful. And long COVID will, I think, be a major problem. And this is something which has impact upon us, because if you're no longer able to get out of your bed, you lose your job, you're no longer contributing to society, the tax revenue is going to go down, the costs of looking after such people is going to go up. This is something which has to be calculated. And again, looking at transparency and governmental hubris, I noted back in January when I asked to have an audience with the Chief Health Officer and was denied. And I wondered why. Would someone not want to share their information with me? So I wrote to the Health Minister asking for some basic information. The bottom line was people had reported to me. I've got no idea if it's true or not, because I'm not working there, I'm not involved in this, but it was reported to me that women who had been vaccinated and they were in their early stages of pregnancy had a 70% chance of early pregnancy loss, as against the normal 10%. Now, you look at that and you say, no way. No, that's not possible. But a very sensible, reasonable, rational colleague of mine said, no, he has a direct communication with people at the hospital involved, and this was the fact. Now, how am I, as a medical practitioner and Member of Parliament, how am I supposed to find out the facts? I can't go to the hospital and say, hey, what are your stats like? I could maybe ask a question without notice in Parliament. I could ask it maybe on notice. But I chose to write to the Health Minister asking, this is of concern, can you please give me information? I would like to speak to the Chief Health Officer. Bearing in mind, apart from the Honourable Steve Thomas, I'm probably the only one who, if he gets into full flow of medical language, understands what he's saying. I also referred a paper there, which this is a peer-reviewed paper in a pretty standard journal, which suggested there were issues with the vaccination. And after 5 weeks, I got a reply back, which basically said, well, the bottom line was, you're not going to see the Chief Health Officer. And the second note was a handwritten note insulting me for putting forward information which was not true, and I should know better as a doctor. And I thought, that's fine, coming from a journalist. Because, you see, when doctors have a problem, one thing that we do is we, first of all, check with a colleague. Hey, have you heard this? What's the go? What's your knowledge of this? And if they can't give any information, we'll then go to the other colleagues. We'll check the resources, check the literature. And if we can't get that, then, of course, we'll maybe seeing who's doing a study, what research is being done in the area, what's the newest on the stand. Now, I am a full-time Member of Parliament and a part-time general practitioner working fairly hard. I don't have time. I've asked my colleagues, and some colleagues are very much on the side, yes, this is a problem. Others saying, no, it's absolutely fine, agreeing with the government. There's no problem there. So 2 points of view. Which point of view could I believe? The papers are coming out. Some are saying yes, some are saying no. So writing to the Chief Health Officer, or via the Health Minister, was my medical way of saying, listen, can I get the facts, please? Can I see what's actually going on? Because I don't know. And the answer I got back was an insult. You should know better. Well, that's why I'm writing to you. That's why I'm asking. I need to know. And that, I think, is also governmental hubris. I don't understand why it's necessary to behave like that. So what we then have is just a fear-based situation treating COVID. Now, it's cost. I look at the budget. How much has it cost? And I appreciate, now, I'm not criticising at all, because I've been through this, I've seen this from the beginning, and I very much understand what the government has done to try and control a pandemic within the borders of Western Australia. And I congratulate the government for doing an excellent job. But just at the last sitting of Parliament, we had the question about extending the emergency procedures. And I put the point across, which was not accepted, that we don't actually have an emergency at this moment. We have a situation. The emergency is actually when it first arises and you're wondering, what do we do about this? What forces can we mobilise? How can we bring to this front and centre? How can we actually control this? Put those things in place, which we need to do. And I gave the example of a patient who came in in extremis, at death's door. And that was an emergency. And as we had sorted that out, we had discovered what's going on, we put the pieces into place, help was coming. That was no longer an emergency, it was a situation that we were managing. Yes, she might have died, but that was simply because it was not avoidable. The emergency had been diagnosed and the procedures had been put in place. The emergency had ceased to exist. What I put out is that we ought to have a pandemic centre. We ought to have a pandemic-specific body. And the example, of course, is in Victoria, where they have introduced a framework specific to pandemics in public health and well-being in their Act 2008. And I thought that was a wonderful idea. We must do this because there will be another pandemic coming up. And this is something that I do not see reflected in the budget papers. If we had another pandemic coming up, and it could be round the corner, we have a multi-drug resistant bacteria now. It doesn't take a great deal of thinking to imagine that these could actually escape our control. Vancomycin-resistant enterococci, the multi-drug resistant Staph aureus, or my particular fear of the multi-drug resistant tuberculosis, which is not too far away from us right now, but in very small amounts. So I do think having proper preparation would be a good idea, and that I do not see reflected in the budget either. We could go on and speak about the boosters and the vaccinations, of course. I'll leave that to one side, because there are, of course, medical questions about this. Now, I have to preface this by saying that in medical terms, things are never as simple as you might imagine. Just a simple fact of having a cold. Why does one person have a cold and the person next living with that person not get a cold? What are the factors involved in that? What are the factors involved with, say, vaccination, immunisation? Can we apply one measure for all people? No, we can't. And what are the figures like? This is another question I had asked of the Health Minister and was rebuffed, quite virulently rebuffed, that the facts are not available to me. I've got figures just now from credible papers, including Elsevier, which do show that there are major concerns. I mean, there's a 38 to 48% efficacy at preventing infection, and between 37 and 73% preventing severe disease. That's one there, which is okay, but it's not great. Bearing in mind that it's absolutely clear that the extent of the damage caused by the COVID is lessened with good vaccination, absolutely clear. Deaths go down, severe disease goes down, but is it perfect? The answer is, I do not think so. Can we find something better? I sincerely hope so. And the example I give is that the last tetanus I saw was 1977. And the vaccination there is absolutely a well-found, effective vaccine. So we could be investigating what about our South Australian developed vaccine? Would that be any better? Could we put some funds into that to get a better result? Apparently, again, I've got no figures to support this, but it's my understanding that from Iran, that the figures there suggest that the efficacy is improved and the adverse effects are down. Why have we not invested in that? And I think those are sensible things that we could do without actually painting any particular devils on the wall. We need to look at this with an open mind, a clear mind, a scientific mind, a fact-led mind. And we'll look again here at the health service, so again, point 11 on page 312, reducing the pressure, expanding emergency care into the waiting room. Now, I was quite surprised at this, because basically you're going to have a waiting room with people who are drunk, people who are drugged up, people who are suffering with minor illnesses, and you're going to have extra nurses triaging people in the waiting room and seeing who needs to be presented more urgently. But the trouble is that the loudest voice is the one which gets heard first. You can experience this, say, in Armadale ED, people walking into the ED who are drunk on drugs and loud and causing a whole lot of trouble. They go through almost immediately. It's the ones who are quiet, the ones you want to watch out for. We learn this in triage when someone's had an MVA and there's multiple incidents there, multiple injuries. The ones who are quiet are the ones you go to. The ones shouting, you leave them alone. The ones who are quiet, you look at them first. And that's the same in ED as well. It's very easy to get distracted by the loud voices. Why are the loud voices there in the first place? They're presenting in a chaotic, disruptive manner. And there's violence, there's abuse, there's danger to others. And they mask the quiet ones who need more urgent care but don't make a noise. And then we've got the Karens. I can give you stories about ED and the Karens in ED. Now, I use that word, and I know they're shaking heads here. It's a useful word to use, but I do have Karens who are friends. Very different. But as a topic there, it's really interesting, looking at the ambulance ramping, for example, the concept, if we had another 100 ambulances on task right now, would there be less ramping? No. If you added 100 ambulances into a fleet right now, active right now, would there be less ramping? There would not. Because the issue isn't the ambulances ramping outside the hospital, it's the inability to move the patients through the hospital. That's where the problem is. And that's something so self-evident to any health practitioner that it has to be said in Parliament very clearly. The problem is not the ambulance service, although there's probably problems to be dealt with there. I won't deny that. Excellent report, by the way. Thank you, Honourable Pierre Yang. But the ramping itself is not solely a problem of the ambulances. And these are things, I think, which if we had more medical input, and I'm sure there's been consultation, but more real medical input from people at the front line, not the bureaucrats who carry the title of doctor or nurse, you'd get better information there. Another one I saw, 11.2, shared real-time data. Now, I don't know if anyone here has actually used the health service IT. And I can think of no better way of wasting nursing time than using the IT within the emergency department. It is slow, it is cumbersome, it is difficult to use, it often blocks you. And if we then extend that to this real-time technology, virtual technology, to see over 24 hours over every day where what needs to be addressed, that is a good idea, but the practicalities of the IT, in my experience so far, have been dire. Let's find the actual problem. What's actually going on in EDs, rather than putting a layer of technology on, which is open to failure as well. And that, again, is another bottom line problem, because if we're not looking after the health department and taking people through in a timely manner, people are going to suffer, people are going to die, and the technology there, which is open to failure, is not going to be anything more than a burden around our necks. At least that is my experience in the past. I'm happy to be proved wrong in the future. And then another nice point there, preparing a business case, a centralised point of care for 24/7 oversight of system-wide operations. That's very bureaucratic. Over 2 years. It's not something that I think brings us any immediate return. Yes, we can look at that. But so far, in health service, IT, you have built a lemon. But it's good that investment is being made. Full marks for that, and I'm very happy for that. However, I now come to speak about the elephant in the room. An elephant that's being ignored. Primary healthcare services, GPs, general practitioners, and the Medicare system. Yes, I know it's a federal issue, but we need to stand up for GPs. Now, the bottom line is that bulk billing, as it's practiced now, is not sustainable for excellent health care. Let me say it once more very clearly. The bulk billing system is not sustainable for excellent health care. We have 6-minute medicine facilities which reduce the doctor to a semi-skilled nurse. There's a doctor working in my clinic just now who is an excellent doctor in training, and I've strongly encouraged her to leave our practice and go to another practice where she'll see how bad general practice can be. And that's actually very typical, where people don't really care about the patient. You're in 6 minutes, here's your script, here's your referral, out you go. Things get missed, very easily get missed. It's a living wage by pushing people through as quickly as possible. You're going to miss diagnoses. You're going to be unable to manage the complex cases. Now, again, as a general practitioner, I am a specialist. You should expect when you come to me, and doctors who are trained like me, that if you have a problem with renal function, we're able to go into that. We can organise the tests, we can assess that. And when we've found out what's going on, we can refer to the specialist for the more specialised care. The same for cardiology. I remember sitting in the cardiology outpatient department as a cardiologist, discharging 95% of the patients back to the general practitioner, because that's where the medicine ought to be done. You're going to check the lipids, you're going to check the renal function again, you're going to check their cardiac capacity, rather than referring them on to the specialist in your 6-minute medicine, as was the case. We need to have the ability of doctors to actually sit down and listen to your patients, because the GPs are the gatekeepers for the health service. They're the gatekeepers to the health service. And when you ignore what general practice does, you actually make the whole system work slower. We should have access to testing for MRI and nuclear medicine, which is allowed to be bulk billed. We need specialists to work as specialists. Now, the AMA and the RACGP, nice as they are, they're not really working on behalf of GPs. That's not our experience as GPs. So we ought to have a look at what we can do to effectively improve how the medical service at GP level can be managed, involving, for example, nurse practitioners, allowing doctors to actually work as doctors rather than as semi-skilled nurses. And the costs of medical care can only rise if you neglect primary care. For example, joint injections. I used to inject joints, but no longer, because I'm no longer getting paid for them. They have to go off to a specialist. Rather than $60, they're paying $600 on Medicare for the imaging, for the injection. That's fine. Far cheaper, far better, far quicker to be done at the general practitioner who knows where the joints are. Reading ECGs. I used to be trained as a cardiologist and no longer get remunerated for reading an ECG. How does this help? Off they go to a cardiologist, blocking beds, blocking access to a cardiologist for things that the GP could easily manage. So the costs are rising, efficiency is falling. And the reason I mention this to government is that the costs of medicine are rising exponentially. Well, I'll rephrase that, are rising. And as a government, you're bound to actually increase those costs. And we see that the costs are increasing year on year. And proudly you say, we have given more than the previous government, or we're adding more money. But the benefits are reducing. And this means, as a business model, it must fail. So at some stage, one or other of the governments is going to stand there and say, this system is falling apart. We can't manage anymore. You'll try and blame the other side, but actually, everyone is involved. We're adding more money into a system which is failing, and it will fail, and you add more money until you can no longer afford to put the money in, and then you're going to wonder, what on earth do we do? Let's fix the problem now. Let's have a close look at what's happening. Let's rethink how we're managing our health services. Let's tackle incompetence, and there's enough of it going around. Let's tackle the inefficiency, the wastage. Let's put preventive medicine to the forefront. It's really great that the government has put excellent dental care into the package. That's fantastic. Let's look at nutrition. We can mandate vaccines, we can mandate clean food. Access to ancillary services. I mean, you'll find all over that it's difficult to find, for example, a psychologist to deal with the mental health issues. Education. Exercise, anti-smoking, anti-vaping, you're saying there as well. And you'd think me remiss if I didn't mention cannabis. So I will. Because cannabis, and indeed the psychedelics, is an area of intense interest to me. I was on a programme this morning with some very eminent people looking at how much more efficient psychedelic medicine and cannabis medicine is in managing mental health. The astronomically improved benefits, which also reflects in an astronomically improved income to the government through revenue, because people are returning to meaningful lives rather than actually killing themselves or harming themselves or finding themselves stuck in the house, unable to move because the medication they're getting is ineffective. And trust me, as a doctor, the medication is not that good. Psychedelics, however, and cannabis are able to do marvellous things at a fraction of the cost, What happens when you do that? Well, you decrease the cost to the community. You increase the improvement in alcoholism and drug addiction. These rates go down. Crime rates fall. Suicides decrease. This is all of benefit to the government. And also note that legalising cannabis would remove cannabis out of the criminal environment. The bonanza that would fall to the government coffers as a result of that, the bonanza is huge. I noted at point 29 on page 315 that they're looking at Serpentine Jarrahdale with the Byford Health Hub, and I think fantastic. excellent. And much of the budget is like this. I can find much to praise, but there are areas where I'd want to improve this. So I look forward to a briefing from the Chief Health Officer. That's only right. It's only right that I get access to the Chief Health Officer. Denying that, people have to ask, why is the only medical officer in the Upper House not being allowed to speak with the man who holds the keys to the information which we need? Where is the transparency? Is it like pea and ham soup? Or can we actually say, really, we've now got the information that this man needs here, this MP needs, to reassure his patients and his electorate that all is well? So these are the areas where emphasis can be placed, and it's my contention that doing so will significantly decrease expenditure and increase revenue. And I encourage the Government to look to such areas to ensure increased revenue with revolutionary approaches to thorny problems.